Ah, how you doing? Good, I hope. Well, I have the answer to the riddle for you from a long time ago. You probably haven't even seen it. When I asked you who the oldest, biggest, original corporation there ever was. So here's the answer. It's the Vatican's corporation. Ah, but they are government too. Yes, I have details down in the description where you can see that is true. I've been reading this book. I mean, I've had so many books I've been reading that had them in it of history. This is the history of the human community. Oh, it's volume Volume 2, 1500 to the present, by William H. McNeill. And right around in the beginning, it was it come to politics and religion. It's not like they haven't been in politics all the time, even in Europe. Yes, back in the Inquisition. See, it wasn't just the Romans that I was thinking that they consisted of, but they were headquartered in Spain. Imagine that. Ever since the Roman Emperor Constantine had allied himself with the Christian Church in AD 312, politics and religion had been closely intertwined in Europe's history. The medieval church had been in the thick of politics. The popes headed an international government that shared authority with secular rulers differently in different places and at different times. Until about 1300, the power of the papacy tended to increase. Thereafter, royal governments in France, Spain, and England took a larger share in church affairs and left less and less real power to the popes. In Germany, however, no strong national government existed. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation had been wrecked by the quarrel with the popes. When the empire was restored in 1273, the first man elected to the imperial dignity was Rudolph of Habsburg, a relatively obscure petty noble who could not possibly challenge the power of the great dukes and princes who ruled the larger states into which the empire had divided. Excuse me. Rudolph did have the rights of his office, however, including the right to reassign any fiefs that happened to fall vacant due to the lack of heirs. Excuse me. During his lifetime, a large fief in Austria fell vacant. Rudolph took it for himself, thus planting the Habsburg family on lands that continued to rule until 1918. Oh, excuse me, I'm not used to talking. The emperor's powers were limited. In 1356, a constitutional document called the Golden Bull, remember that, defined how the emperor should be chosen. 7 great princes were named electors, with the right to choose the emperor. In addition, there was a diet, an assembly or a council, like the English Parliament, to which all the princes and free cities sent representatives. Both the electors and the diet were interested in keeping the imperial government weak, so as to leave as many rights to themselves as they could. Hence, the empire remained a confusing collection of states, almost but not quite independent of one another, presided over by an emperor who, most of the time, could not get his subjects to obey him, pay him taxes, or cooperate in common policies. Which reminds me of them today, since they are forcing us taxpayers to pay the franchises of the Vatican, which are their churches. They are franchises. Like any other secular corporation there is. If they're doing secular work, then according to the Bible, they are supposed to render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and unto God what belongs to God. And they don't want to do that. So, moving along here. Then it talks about the Habsburg Empire of Charles V. That's Charles the Fifth. V means fifth, doesn't it? I haven't used those kind of letterings in a long time, but they did back then a lot. Then it talks about Luther and Calvin, religious and dynastic wars. Oh, and you know, they also talk about science and religion in it. And that ought to be read by you. That is not something I'm getting into tonight, okay? But I thought it was very interesting at the end of this, in the conclusion of this chapter. The common denominator of all the confusing changes that came to Europe between 1500 and 1650 was this: Western Europeans learned how to expand and intensify activity in almost every sphere of human concern. Overall, this meant a great increase in the power of their civilization, both at home and in contacts with other cultural traditions. New kinds of organization allowed larger numbers to cooperate in peaceable and in warlike undertakings. The joint stock company, for example, was perfected just after 1600. Under a legal charter, it allowed the shared ownership of a company through the purchase of stock. The joint owners were liable in case of bankruptcy for only the amount of money each of them had invested. And of course, as long as the company prospered, a joint owner would sell his share, sometimes at a price higher than he paid for it. Modern corporations are built on the same principles. This kind of business organization allowed thousands to work together over long periods of time for goals defined by a small group of managers. Savings could be pooled, risks spread out, and special skills put to fuller uses by this kind of organization than was possible with family businesses or partnerships. In politics, nothing quite so dramatic as the joint stock company was invented. Bureaucracy and standing armies were not new, but they became much more efficient and took charge of more and more activities. Local self-help and the authority of separate town governments suffered. So did the rights of noble lords over their peasants. Simultaneously, it became easier for merchants to buy or sell anywhere within the kingdom without having to submit to local guild rules. Royal and princely governments also learned how to mobilize a larger proportion of the resources of their subjects for public purposes. Everything became much more complicated as it assumed a larger scale. A handful of knights, supported by local peasants, no longer had any value on the battlefield. Instead, by the end of the period, Dozens of cannons and thousands of muskets were what mattered, along with men carefully trained to use these weapons effectively. Skilled artisans, financiers, miners, smelters, wagon train drivers, riverboat captains, and crews of sea-going vessels, tax collectors, army officers, drill masters, and literally thousands of other specialists was needed to create and maintain such armies. But the cooperation of so many specialists produced more effective armies. Every new invention or improvement that worked spread rapidly, for no government could long afford to be without an armed force that could hold its own against neighboring states. In thought and in culture, too, Europeans were able to find many new ways to mobilize greater energies. Sale of printed books, for example, allowed a man such as Esdras to make a living as an author and scholar without having to take a post in a university or with the church. The theater, too, by charging admission, created a livelihood for actors and playwrights such as William Shakespeare. Together, these changes gave secular literature a wider scope than before. The printing press also had great importance in spreading new ideas more rapidly and more accurately than previously. Luther's pamphlets, for example, made it practicable for anyone in Germany to learn the full details of his challenge to the papacy from Luther's own words, and to hear the arguments of his opponents as well. In less controversial fields, too, the printing press made exchange of information far more efficient. Travelers' reports of new lands, woodcuts portray newly discovered objects, maps drawn according to the latest information, anatomical and botanical drawings, mathematical proofs, philosophical or theological arguments, any sort of data, in fact, could be made public through printing. This meant that those who cared about any particular line of inquiry could secure the latest and best information much more easily than before, even when they happened to live far away from the place where a new invention or new things had been discovered. Once again, human energies over wider areas could be mobilized more efficiently. Each new idea or new bit of knowledge that entered European learning gave people more to think about. And just as the best supplied and best organized armies usually won battles, so also the best informed and most experienced minds usually won arguments, and in doing so enriched, enlarged, and expanded the intellectual inheritance of Europe as a whole. Nowhere else in the world were these centuries nearly so full of fundamental novelties and departures from old ways. The appearance of well-armed European vessels along the shores of Asia did not make much difference to the old civilizations of that part of the world. Muslims, Hindus, Chinese, and Japanese were interested in keeping what they had and in keeping any necessary changes to a minimum. Only Europeans found it possible and necessary to question the assumptions of their ancestors so drastically and so fruitfully. As a result, Europeans slowly but surely began to leave other peoples behind. And I have to admit, I'm ready for change. Big change. Okay? Hope you have a great day tomorrow and a lovely night. Sweet dreams. See you later.